The history of ancient Rome occupies a special place in the world's civilization. Few states have left such a deep mark on the politics, law, architecture, and culture of mankind. Rome went from a small village on the banks of the Tiber to the capital of a vast empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. Its institutions and traditions influenced the Middle Ages and modern times, and the concepts of Roman law, Roman order, and even Roman road became household names. Sources on the history of Rome are diverse. We have both ancient historians, Titus Livy, Polybius, Tacitus, Suetonius, and archaeological finds. However, the early history of Rome is closely intertwined with legends. The Romans loved to see in their past a divine destiny and heroic deeds. Therefore, the first epic, the Tsarist period, is described half by myths, half by real facts. The legendary foundation and the royal period via centuries BC, the legend of Romulus and Remus. According to Roman legend, the beginning of the city is associated with the twin brothers Romulus and Remus. Their mother, the priestess Rhea Silvia, according to legend, conceived them from Mars himself, the god of war. Uncle Amulius, who seized power in Alba Longa, ordered the babies to be disposed of. But fate decreed otherwise. A basket with children landed on the banks of the Tiber, and a she-wolf came out, which became the main symbol of Rome. Later, the brothers decided to found a city on Palatine Hill. A quarrel broke out between them about who would be in charge, and Romulus killed Remus. Thus Rome arose in 753 BC, and Romulus became its first king. This legend highlights the key values of the Romans: militancy, strength, dedication to fate, and ancestor worship. The she-wolf is still the emblem of Rome today. Early settlers and Latins. Rome originated in the region of Latium, where Latin tribes lived. These were farmers and pastoralists who united to protect themselves from their Sabine and Etruscan neighbors. The early Roman community included 3 tribes, tribal unions divided into clans. These associations were the foundation of a social and military organization. Early Rome was a small fortified settlement on 7 hills. The population was several thousand people. The main occupations were farming, cattle breeding, and hunting. Gradually, a stratum of patricians emerged from the ancestral nobility, while ordinary farmers made up the plebs. Etruscan influence. The Etruscans, a more developed people who lived further north in the Etruria region, had a huge impact on early Rome. The Romans borrowed architecture, stone arches, sewers, temple construction, religious rituals, and even some symbols of power from them. For example, a bunch of rods with an axe, fascia, became a symbol of the magistrate's authority. The Etruscan kings ruled Rome until the end of the 6th century BC, and it was they who turned the village into a real city with a forum square, temples, and fortress walls. The social structure of early Rome during the Tsarist period. Roman society was divided into 3 main groups. Patricians are the ancestral nobility, descendants of the first settlers. They have the right to participate in the Senate and hold important positions. The plebeians are free but disenfranchised farmers, artisans, and merchants. Initially, they were strangers in the city and had no access to power. Clients are dependent people attached to patrician families. Even then, the features that would become the most important in Roman history appeared: the conflict between the nobility and the common people, as well as the desire for an orderly law. The fall of Tsarist power and the birth of the Republic. The last king of Rome was the Etruscan ruler Tarquin the Proud. His rule became a symbol of tyranny. According to legend, his son Sextus committed violence against a noble woman, Lucretia, which caused a popular uprising. In 509 BC, the Romans expelled the kings and vowed to no longer tolerate the monarchy. Thus began a new era, the Republic res publica, common cause. Governance has now passed to elected magistrates, the Senate, and the people's assemblies. This was an important step in the history of Rome and distinguished it from neighboring monarchies. The early Republic, 8th centuries BC, the struggle of the patricians and plebeians after the expulsion of the kings. Power was concentrated in the hands of the patricians, who controlled the Senate and the election of magistrates. The plebeians, who made up the majority of the population, found themselves at a disadvantage. They had no political rights, suffered from debt slavery, and lack of protection in the courts. This led to a prolonged class struggle. The first success of the plebeians was the so-called First Secession for 194 BC, when they left the city in protest and refused to fight. Rome was threatened by enemies, and the patricians were forced to make concessions. A new institution appeared, the tribunes of the people, who protected the plebeians from the arbitrariness of the nobility and had the right to veto the decisions of the magistrates. Over time, the plebeians gained access to the priesthood, the consulate, and other positions. By the 4th century BC, equality of estates was formally established, although in fact rich families continued to dominate. Creation of Roman institutions, the Republic became a unique form of government, combining elements of aristocracy, democracy, and monarchy. Magistrates were elected for a year and governed the state. The most important are consuls to people so that no one usurps power, praetors judges, aediles organization of games and economy, quaestors finance and censors census, composition of the Senate. The Senate consisted of former magistrates and was in fact the main body that determined foreign and domestic policy. The people's assemblies passed laws and elected officials. This distribution of powers made it possible to avoid tyranny, and the system of checks and balances became a model for future states. Laws of the G-Tables. One of the key steps in the development of Roman statehood was the drafting of the laws of the 12th century C. For 150 BC, the plebeians demanded a written law in order to know their rights and not depend on the arbitrariness of the patricians. The laws were stamped on bronze tables and displayed on the forum. They regulated legal proceedings, family law, inheritance, and punishments. Although many norms looked harsh, for example, the death penalty for theft, this became the foundation of Roman jurisprudence and the first step towards the principle of equality of all before the law. The conquests of Italy in parallel with the internal struggle, the Republic was actively expanding its territories. At first, the Romans waged wars with their neighbors, the Etruscans, Volscians, and Sabines. The Samnites became the most serious enemy. The Samnite Wars IV centuries BC lasted for decades. Despite heavy defeats, the Battle of the Kavdinsky Gorge, 321 BC, Rome prevailed. At the beginning of the 3rd century BC, the Romans encountered Greek colonies in southern Italy. The city of Tarentum turned to King Pyrrhus of Epirus for help. The war with him brought the famous expression Pyrrhic victory. Although Pyrrhus won, his losses were so great that he could not maintain success. As a result, the Greeks lost ground and Rome subjugated all of Italy. Alliances and governance of conquered peoples. After the conquest of Italy, the Romans showed amazing flexibility. Instead of total enslavement, they formed alliances with the peoples. Some cities received the status of Roman citizens without the right to vote. They were required to serve in the army but could not participate in elections. Others retained their autonomy but had to follow Roman foreign policy. This system made it possible to unite different tribes and provide a huge mobilization resource. Rome became the strongest power of the Apennine Peninsula. Punic Wars and domination of the Mediterranean centuries BC. The First Punic War, Rome's main rival in the international arena, turned out to be Carthage, a powerful maritime power in North Africa that controlled the western Mediterranean. The cause of the conflict was the struggle for Sicily. In 260 BC, the First Punic War began. Carthage had a powerful navy, and the Romans began building warships for the first time. According to legend, they copied the captured Carthaginian trireme. To compensate for the inexperience of the sailors, the Romans invented the Raven, a boarding bridge that made it possible to turn naval combat into land combat. After 20 years of hard war, Rome was victorious and received Sicily, its first province. It was a step towards becoming a maritime power. The Second Punic War, Hannibal. A few decades later, a new clash began. In 218 BC, the Carthaginian commander Hannibal Barca undertook a daring campaign. He crossed the Alps with an army and wore elephants, attacking Italy. The Romans suffered a number of catastrophic defeats at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and especially at Cannae 116 BC, where more than 50,000 soldiers died. This defeat became a symbol of Hannibal's military genius. However, Rome showed resilience. He refused to capitulate, gathered new armies, and launched an offensive in Spain and Africa. In 200 BC, the Roman general Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal at Zama. Carthage was forced to give up its fleet and overseas possessions. The Third Punic War and the destruction of Carthage. Despite the defeat, Carthage remained a wealthy trading city. Many Roman politicians demanded its destruction. Cato the Elder ended each speech with the words, "Carthage must be destroyed." In 149 to 146 BC, the Romans besieged Carthage. After a fierce defense, the city fell. The inhabitants were sold into slavery, and the lands were declared the property of Rome. That's how the main rival disappeared. Conquests in the east. At the same time, Rome began to expand into the Hellenistic world. The wars with Macedonia and Syria ended with the inclusion of Greece and Asia Minor in the sphere of Roman influence. This led to an influx of wealth, slaves, and Greek culture. Hellenic art, philosophy, and literature had a huge impact on the Roman elite. The social consequences of expansion. The victories made Rome a world center, but they also created a crisis. Slaves poured into Italy, which devastated small farmers. Lands were concentrated in the hands of the nobility, and latifundia were created. There was a mass of landless citizens who moved to Rome and lived off handouts. This became the basis for social upheaval and political instability in the following centuries. The late Republic 3 centuries BC crisis of the traditional system. After conquering the Mediterranean, Rome faced profound social and political changes. The old institutions designed for the city-state could not cope with the management of a huge power. The Senate, which formerly remained the main body, found itself under the rule of a narrow oligarchy. The small farmers who served as the backbone of the army went bankrupt and moved to the cities. Slave labor in the latifundia displaced the free peasants. Masses of landless people flocked to the capital, waiting for bread and circuses. This led to increased tensions and the emergence of new political leaders who tried to reform the system. The reforms of the Gracchi, the first to speak, were the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchi in the century BC. They proposed to limit the size of the lands owned by the nobility and distribute them to poor citizens. Tiberius Gracchus Tribune in 133 BC tried to pass a land law. He was supported by the people, but the Senate took it as a threat. As a result, Tiberius was killed along with his supporters. Gaius Gracchus continued his brother's work. He expanded the program to help the poor and offered to give the allies citizenship. His policies provoked fierce resistance, and he also died. The death of the Gracchi showed that Rome had entered an era of political violence. Contradictions were no longer resolved solely by laws. The Allied War and the expansion of rights. Another serious crisis was the Allied War 188 BC. Rome's Italian allies, who had served in the army and paid taxes for a long time, demanded civil rights. The Senate's refusal sparked a rebellion. The war was difficult, but in the end the Romans agreed to grant citizenship to all the allies. This made Italy a unified civic space, but increased competition within the political system itself. The dictatorship of Sulla. Against the background of social upheavals, the ambitions of the commanders intensified. One of them was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. After winning the Civil War, he established a dictatorship AD to 279 BC. Unlike traditional temporary dictatorships, his power was almost absolute. He carried out reforms, strengthened the Senate, limited the people's assemblies and the power of the tribunes. But the main thing is that for the first time Sulla used the army as a means of personal power. His soldiers were loyal not to the state, but to the commander who provided them with land and loot. This has become a dangerous precedent for the future. The first triumvirate Caesar, Pompey, Crassus, in the second half of the 1st century BC, three influential figures entered the political arena: Gaius Julius Caesar, Gnaeus Pompey, and Rome's richest man, Marcus Crassus. They formed an unofficial alliance, the first triumvirate, to bypass the Senate. Crassus controlled the financial circles. Pompey was popular as a victor in the wars in the East. Caesar received the consulship and an appointment to Gaul, where he began a long military campaign. The conquest of Gaul 58 to 50 BC brought Caesar incredible fame. He created a strong army ready to follow him against the Senate. The Civil War and Caesar's death, the death of Crassus and Parthia, upset the balance. The Senate, led by Pompey, demanded that Caesar disband his troops. But in 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon with the words, "The die is cast." The Civil War began. Caesar quickly captured Italy, defeated Pompey's forces at Pharsalus 48 BC, and established himself as the sole ruler. He carried out a number of reforms, increased the Senate, began colonization of provinces by veterans, improved the calendar. The Julian calendar was introduced. However, his power caused fear. On March 15, 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated by conspirators led by Brutus and Cassius. Their hopes for the restoration of the Republic did not materialize. The country plunged into new wars. The second triumvirate, Antony, Octavian, Lepidus. After Caesar's assassination, his supporters seized power. Mark Antony, Octavian adopted son and heir, and Marcus Lepidus. They formed a second triumvirate with official powers. Caesar's assassins were declared enemies. In 42 BC, under Philippi, the troops of the triumvirs defeated Brutus and Cassius. The Republic has virtually ceased to exist. The union soon broke up. Lepidus was eliminated, and a struggle began between Antony and Octavian. Antony tied the knot with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. This angered the Romans, who saw him as a traitor. In 31 BC, Octavian won a decisive victory in the Battle of Actium. Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide. Octavian became the sole ruler. In 27 BC, he received the title of Augustus, and a new era began, the Roman Empire. Empire, Principate, centuries AD. Augustus and the establishment of the Principate. After defeating Antony, Octavian turned out to be the sole ruler of a huge state. However, he remembered Caesar's fate and understood that an open dictatorship would provoke resistance. Therefore, he built a new system, the Principate. In 27 BC, the Senate solemnly bestowed upon him the title of Augustus Exalted. Formally, the Republic was preserved. There were magistrates, a Senate, and national assemblies. But the real power was concentrated in the hands of Augustus. He controlled the army as the supreme commander imperator. He held the high priestly title Pontifex Maximus. He had the powers of a tribune and censor. Thus, Augustus was first among equals, princeps, not a king. But in fact, it was a new political system, a monarchy disguised as a republic. The Julius Claudian dynasty. After Augustus' death, power passed to his relatives. This is how the first imperial dynasty, the Iuli Claudi, arose. Tiberius 14-37 strengthened the army, but his rule was marred by suspicion and repression. Caligula 37-41 went down in history as a symbol of a mad despot. His eccentricity and cruelty led to a conspiracy and murder. Claudius 41-54 was a scientist and administrator. He expanded the empire by annexing Britain. NER 05-68 is remembered for the persecution of Christians and the fire of Rome. His death ended the dynasty and caused a brief period of turmoil. The Flavian dynasty. After the crisis of 68-69, when several contenders fought for power, the commander Vespasian won. He founded the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian restored order, strengthened finances, and began construction of the Colosseum. His son Titus became famous for ending the war with Judea and opening the Colosseum, but died young. Domitian ruled as an autocrat, but was assassinated by the conspirators. The Flavians finally turned the Principate into a de facto monarchy. The golden age of the Antonines. From the end of the 1st to the 2nd century, Rome reached the peak of its power. The Antonine era 96-192 is considered the golden age. Nerva established the tradition of adopting worthy heirs. Trajan 98 to 117 expanded the empire to its largest borders, conquering Dacia, present-day Romania, Armenia, and Mesopotamia. Hadrian 117 to 138 strengthened the borders. He built the famous wall in Britain. Antoninus Pius ruled peacefully and fairly. Marcus Aurelius 161 to 180 was a philosopher on the throne, the author of Reflections. His reign was complicated by German invasions and the plague. This era was characterized by stability, a flourishing economy, law, and culture. Roman law and culture in the 1st and 2nd centuries, Roman law reached maturity. Lawyers have developed rules of ownership, contracts, inheritance. The principal law is the art of goodness, and justice has become the basis of European jurisprudence. The culture combined Roman and Greek elements. Architecture has reached greatness, amphitheaters, thermal baths, aqueducts, roads. Literature has given the world Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Tacitus, Pliny. The spread of Christianity was of particular importance. Initially, it was persecuted, but gradually gained more and more followers. Economy and army. The empire was based on 3 pillars: agriculture, slave labor, and the army. Agriculture remained the main occupation, but slavery gradually transformed. Instead of large latifundia, the labor of colonists, dependent tenants, increased. The army numbered about 300,000 legionnaires. She ensured the security of the borders and maintained the power of the emperor. A network of roads and trade connected vast territories, ensuring the circulation of goods, money, and ideas. The crisis of the 3rd century, after the death of Marcus Aurelius, a gradual decline began. His son Commodus proved to be an unworthy ruler and was killed. In the following decades, power passed from one commander to another. The 3rd century went down in history as the crisis of empire. Constant civil wars, barbarian invasions, Goths, Franks, Persians, economic crisis, inflation, decline of trade, the weakening of the army, and the growing separatism of the provinces. The empire was undergoing severe upheavals, but still managed to survive thanks to the reforms of powerful rulers, primarily Diocletian and Constantine in the 4th century. The late empire and the dominate IV centuries AD Diocletian and the reforms by the end of the 3rd century, the empire was on the verge of collapse. The power of the emperors became short-lived. Soldiers proclaimed and overthrew the rulers one by one. To stabilize the situation, Diocletian came to power 184 to 305. He carried out radical reforms. He established a new system of government. The Tetrarchy, the power of 4. To Augustus and 2 Caesars were to jointly rule a huge power. Divided the provinces into small units to strengthen control. He carried out a tax reform. He established a strict census of lands and taxes. He strengthened the army and imposed strict military discipline. The main change concerned the nature of power. While the Augustan Principate maintained the appearance of a republic, Diocletian established a dominant monarchy. The emperor was now called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Diocletian is also known for major persecutions of Christians. He tried to preserve traditional cults, but faith in Christ was already firmly spreading in society. Constantine and Christianity. After Diocletian's abdication, a new struggle for power began. The winner was Constantine the Great, 306 to 337. His reign was a turning point. In 313, he issued the Edict of Milan, which proclaimed freedom of religion and effectively legalized Christianity. In 325, he convened the Council of Nicaea, where the unified doctrine of the Church was formulated. In 330, he founded a new capital, Constantinople, formerly Byzantium, which soon became the main center of the Eastern Empire. Constantine actually made Christianity the state religion, although he himself was baptized only on his deathbed. His steps determined the fate of Europe for centuries to come. Division of the empire. Already under the successors of Constantine, it became clear that the empire was too large for unified governance. In 395, after the death of Theodosius I, the final division took place into the western with the capital in Rome, then in Ravenna, and the eastern with the capital in Constantinople empires. The eastern part, later called Byzantium, lasted for another 1,000 years. The western one turned out to be more vulnerable to barbarian invasions. Since the 4th century, the borders of Rome began to be subjected to increasingly destructive attacks by Germanic tribes and nomads. In 410, the Visigoths, led by Alaric, took and plundered Rome itself, an event that shocked contemporaries. In the middle of the 5th century, the threat increased with the arrival of the Huns. In 451, in the Battle of the Catalaunian Fields, the Romans, together with the Visigoths, stopped Attila, but the threat remained. In 455, Rome was sacked again, this time by Vandals. The empire was rapidly losing territories. Britain, Spain, and Gaul came under the rule of barbarian kingdoms. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, 476. The formal end of the history of Western Rome was 476, when the German leader Odoacer deposed the last emperor Romulus Augustulus. The Senate sent signs of imperial authority to Constantinople. This year is traditionally considered the end of antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages. Conclusion: the history of ancient Rome is a journey from a small settlement on the Tiber to a world state. Over several centuries, the Romans created unique political institutions, conquered the entire Mediterranean world, and passed on a rich heritage to their descendants. The main result: politics. The Roman Republic and its system of checks and balances have become the prototype for many modern states. Law. Roman law formed the basis of European legal systems. Culture. Latin gave rise to the Romance languages. Architecture and engineering have become a model for centuries. Religion. It was in Rome that Christianity transformed from a persecuted sect into a world religion. The fall of the Western Empire did not mean the disappearance of Rome. The Eastern Empire, Byzantium, continued to live for another 1,000 years, and the ideas and images of Rome inspired medieval and new rulers, from Charlemagne to Napoleon. Rome has remained a symbol of strength and order, and its legacy lives on in every European state, in every legal code, in every city with bridges and roads built on the Roman model.